Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Barhate. Thank you very much for this enlightening speech. Now, I would like to, now the second talk of this first session it is titled as Pop Goes Gandhi, Myth and the Making of Mahatma in Popular Culture, which will be delivered by Dr. Prantik Banerjee. Now, Dr. Prantik Banerjee is an associate professor, Department of English and former IQSCE coordinator, Hislop College, Nagpur. His areas of interest are cultural studies, film theory, medical humanities, post-colonial studies, trauma theory, gerontology, and disability studies. He is also interested in higher education policies, quality assurance frameworks, and curriculum designing. He has been a keynote speaker and resource person at several international and national conferences. He delivered the annual endowment lectures in several universities. His publications include one book, 3 anthologies, 6 book chapters, and 36 research papers in peer-reviewed national and international journals. He is a member of Board of Studies of several universities. He is also a PhD supervisor as well as PhD examiner. He was invited as an expert on the drafting committee of NCCI's higher education policy. He has served as NAC expert and Rusha trainer and conducted many training programs for colleges and universities in India. He is an external advisor to IQAC of reputed colleges and universities. He was invited as expert on selection committee of prestigious colleges. He is a certified HRD trainer from Tata Consultancy Services, Bengaluru, and has conducted several teacher and corporate training programs. He is also a published poet and short story writer. His articles have featured in several newspapers. Now I would like to request Dr. Prantik Banerjee to proceed with his talk. Dr. Banerjee.
Thank you. First of all, a very good evening or a good morning, depends on where the participants are right now connected with us. My commiserations with our first speaker, Shrikant Barhate, and we hope that he gets well soon. And in a sense, you know, that kind of is a pointed reminder about the main purpose of today's symposium, that even as we discuss, introspect, and meditate over the many terrains, both the political, the moral, and the social philosophy of Gandhi, perhaps what Shrikant Barhate, talked about is in a sense a pointer to the relevance of Gandhi, even as we speak or even as we digitally connect with people across the world in these lockdown coronavirus times. Gandhi's underlying principle, his core philosophy of compassion, humanity, and nonviolence is perhaps a marker, perhaps gains an urgency and an immediacy, a more vital relevance than any other time than today's pandemic times. And so wishing Dr. Barhate a speedy recovery. Friends, I'm going to shift the terrain on which I'm going to take you to a different, or rather to a different landscape altogether. While Mr. Barhate has given us a pretty good idea, he's walked the talk across the general philosophy and the abiding principles of Gandhism and Gandhi philosophy. I'm going to talk about something that is perhaps more closer to our, not to our hearts, but to our everyday lives, and that is Gandhi in the context of popular culture. So the topic of my talk is Pop Goes Gandhi, Myth and the Making of Mahatma in Popular Culture. And I'll request the host to share my screen. But before that, let me quickly, an anecdote that strikes me at the very beginning of my, even as I'm thinking about what to talk and what to place before you, I'm reminded of Ramchandra Guha. Shrikant Barhate made a mention of Guha. Ramchandra Guha, one of India's finest historians and a writer of not one but three books on Gandhi, uh, had this interesting anecdote to tell. Apparently, after the first volume of his Gandhi biography, titled, I think it was called India Before Gandhi, or Gandhi Before India, uh, he when the book came out in 2013, he was in a New York hotel promoting this book, and the book was on his table, and someone from the housekeeping came in to clean the room, his room, and saw the book. Now, he didn't know it was Ramchandra Guha's book, but seeing the book, he said, this housekeeping attendant said, "Oh, that's the young Mr. Gandhi, isn't it?" And so this person was able to recognize Gandhi from the cover page of that particular book, of Ramchandra Guha's book, Gandhi Before India. The cover photo showed Gandhi in a lawyer's suit as a young lawyer. Many a times we've seen such photos in our school textbooks. And so this attendant said, he tells Ramchandra Guha, sir, he's greatly admired in my country. And Guha asked this gentleman from the hotel staff, friend, where are you from? What is your country? And so the answer that this man gave was, well, I'm from the Dominican Republic. And Guha, remembering this episode with the hotel staff, writes in a sequel to his first book, he writes, now I'm absolutely certain, he says, that Gandhi had not heard of the Dominican Republic. But the Dominican Republic had heard of Gandhi. Friends, that's it. Gandhi did not and does not belong to India. He belongs to the world. And so, like an absent-minded professor, I said I'm going to share my screen. Just let me.
Dr. Banerjee, I have allowed you to share your screen, so you can share your screen. Okay? At the bottom, there should be an option of sharing screen.
Yeah. Is it visible?
Yeah, it is visible.
All right. Thanks. So, like I was saying, that Gandhi was is a figure much adulated, much admired, and who does not belong to India. He is not only pan-India but pan-universal, and so these are the books that I was talking about, and this is the incident. The young Gandhi in Ramchandra Guha's first book, Gandhi Before India, and so when Time magazine featured him as the person of the year way back in 1930, it was paying tribute to a man whose ideas had already tremendously impacted the world. And this is interesting, much before he freed India from British rule in 1947. So such was the extent, and such was the extent of Gandhi's influence in 1930 that he was nominated as the person of the year in 1930. Friends, today I'm going to talk on, like I said, Pop Goes Gandhi, Myth and the Making of Mahatma in Popular Culture. So in my talk, I'm going to focus on the complex and problematic nature of representations of Gandhi. That is, how his philosophy and his legacy has been represented in popular culture. And by popular culture, I mean how Gandhi has been used as a narrative or as an image or as a trope in films, fiction, comics, graphic novels, songs, cartoons, and even jokes. What I'll try to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to demonstrate to you with a range of examples from various forms of popular culture, but especially literature and films, um, the troublesome relationship that Gandhi, the subject of these narratives, the subject has with these narratives, and the troublesome relationship that these narratives have with the popular reception of the readers, the viewers, and the audiences of these forms of popular culture. So I'm going to look at certain issues embedded in the narrative, such as how is Gandhi mythified? How is he turned into a myth in popular culture? What are the popular myths about Gandhi presented in films and books and comic strips and graphic novels? And I'm also going to look at the question of, that does the iconography of Gandhi have contradictory and conflicting strands? And has this iconography of Gandhi, the image of Gandhi over a period of so many decades, has it changed with the passage of time? The central question that I'm going to examine by putting forth before you certain deliberations is that is the deification of Gandhi, raising Gandhi to the status of a god, is that a cultural phenomena which has also simultaneously, which has also concurrently witnessed the debasement, the vilification, or even the criticism of Gandhi? And finally, I would like to wrap up my talk by examining how, for example, has Gandhism, his principles and practice evolved in popular culture of today's times. When we talk about Gandhi, or for that matter, any great leader that has strode across the political firmament in the last century and even today, and in this millennium. So, leaders and leadership always evolves around certain myths and certain popular culture. And this popular culture, the extent of this popular culture, its pervasiveness, its circulation and distribution plays a very important role in how we think about our leaders. What are the primary images or even the primary values with which we associate ourselves with these leaders, and what functionality do these values and principles that these leaders espouse or these leaders embody play in our day-to-day lives? Because, leaving aside scholarship, I mean, there are entire libraries and museums on Gandhi, but perhaps at the ground level, at the very ground level, the manner in which India and the world today imagines or thinks about Gandhi is through the many forms of popular culture, because the popular culture, nothing captures the imagination of the masses, and that includes we. Nothing captures the imagination of the masses as vividly, as imaginatively, as the circulation of books, films, and literature, which seem to present many a leader, including Gandhi, as a legend, as an icon, as an idol to be worshipped and to be admired and to be adulated. Let us think for a minute. When we think of how a short, scrawny, bespectacled man clad in a dhoti or a loincloth and holding a stick became one of the tallest leaders, not only for India, but for the entire world, one is easily struck with awe and reverence. And the mythification of Gandhi begins from this reverence, from this attitude of reverence itself. Just think of the world's greatest leaders of the 20th century. I take you back to history, and if you think of the world's greatest leaders of the 20th century, those who have impacted upon not only the politics of their own nations and the world, but whose primary legacy, the testimony of whose thoughts continue to prevail in today's times. So when we think of the world's greatest leaders, whether it is Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., or the Dalai Lama, it is amazing that Gandhi had influenced all of them. World leaders, and these are world leaders who stood up for civil rights, who fought for the freedom and equality of men. So Gandhi uh, influenced people from all walks of life, not just political leaders. Albert Einstein, for example, was an ardent admirer of Gandhi, and the two had a long correspondence, sharing their ideas and their views on religion and politics. In fact, when Gandhi died, on his passing away, it was Einstein who said memorably that generations to come will scarce believe that such a one as this, ever in flesh and blood, walked upon this earth. So, Gandhi percolates, Gandhi seeps through many a legend and many and in the and many a legendary figure whose thoughts and philosophies he has inspired, he has influenced over a period of time. I mean, closer to our century, for example, management guru and best-selling author Stephen Covey, for instance, we all read and cite and use the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, a book that we often use in our classroom. Covey it was Covey who drew from Gandhi's ideas of the seven social sins. The sins that Gandhi talked about on how these seven core evils were to be avoided in order, according to Gandhi, in order to pursue, in order to walk the path towards truth. And these sins that he mentioned was, for example, wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, knowledge, for example, without character, uh, uh, science without humanity, religion without sacrifice, and politics without principle. I mean, these were the founding principles, or rather the founding evils that Gandhi had forewarned. And these social sins were the ones that Stephen Covey utilized for his book, his 1989 bestseller, uh, Principled Centered Leadership. So the inspiration for a best-selling book, which has continued, which has had an abiding influence on not just on the polity of nations, but also on our individual lives, has been Gandhi. Uh, how pervasive has Gandhi's influence been? Another example that I can give you is from the world of technology and Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was one of Gandhi's many admirers, and he co-opted, not surprisingly, he co-opted and drafted Gandhi's image for a series of advertisements for Apple computers in the late 1990s with the tagline, "Think different." So, like with great leaders, worldwide, whether you're talking about a Martin Luther King Jr. or a Lincoln, an Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi, it is true, has also drawn a fair amount of criticism, some coming from the most prominent political leaders of his own time. In fact, in the 1930s, at the height of the freedom movement against the British, and when Gandhi was having a series of roundtable conferences in London, it was Churchill who described Gandhi, Churchill who was not then the prime minister, but it was Churchill who described Gandhi as very disparagingly as a seditious Middle Temple lawyer posing as a fakir of a type well known in the East. Indeed, in our own country, Gandhi has always been, a subject of intense debate and sometimes fierce disagreement. Uh, and this is interesting to me, in a way in which, for example, the Americans don't really debate about Lincoln, or the fact that the Chinese don't really debate about Mao Zedong, or the Vietnamese don't really debate about Ho Chi Minh, or indeed, even the Pakistanis don't really debate about Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Uh, Gandhi's life, presents itself as a conundrum, one of contrasts and contradictions. I mean, here is an example from, for example, the westernized lawyer who wore the clothes of India's poorest and spun cotton by hand, or for that matter, the apostle of nonviolence who led an Indian ambulance corps during the Boer War in South Africa, and who urged Indians to enlist in the First World War. Or for that matter, Gandhi as the champion of Indian independence, who never actually hated the British. So the point I'm trying to make here is that both in popular imagination, Gandhi has been a very contentious figure. He evokes conflicting reactions from individuals and groups, depending, of course, upon their political affiliations, their political leanings, and their practicing ideologies. Recently, Arundhati Roy, the famous novelist and social activist, has written a pretty damning account of Gandhi in her introduction to B.R. Ambedkar's The Annihilation of Caste, a book that Ambedkar published way back in 1936. But I'm not going to go into the debate, into the details of the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate. That is not within the purview of my talk. The point I'm trying to make here is that, that Gandhi has been, like I said, a conundrum. Love him or hate him, Gandhi in his own lifetime and even now with the ongoing celebrations of his 150th birth anniversary, Gandhi continues to draw both acclaim as well as opprobrium in almost equal measure from different quarters and for very different reasons. Indeed, he is perhaps the most written about. Is perhaps the most written about and yet the least understood leader of the 20th century. Friends, in India, Gandhi is everywhere. As I put on the slide, for example, a collage of images that we all can relate to, whether it is the Children's Day or fancy dress where children, it's such a popular thing in India for children to dress up as Gandhi in fancy dress competitions, or for that matter, the Amul butter that we put on our toast, right? Which of course, ironically, is an English breakfast, but nevertheless, so Amul, the butter of the nation, and then, it has its tagline, remembering the father of the nation, remembering the father of the nation, and Amul, the butter of the nation. Or for that matter, the stamps, Gandhi's images are prolific and pervasive across all the stamps commemorating his various anniversaries, including the 150th birth anniversary. And of course, the government of India's Swachh Bharat movement also is based on Gandhi's philosophy and Gandhi's pragmatic politics. So, ek kadam swachhata ki aur. The way we venerate Bapu, or he's venerated, for example, on the 2nd of October, which is a public holiday and which is celebrated as Gandhi Jayanti. He's also commemorated on the 30th of January, the day of his assassination, which we observe as Martyrs' Day, and people observe 2-minute silence. There's along with his political beliefs of ahimsa and satyagraha, the two core ideals of Gandhian philosophy, ahimsa and satyagraha. It's interesting that the moral ideas that we associate with Gandhi, such as the inclusion of Dalits or the inclusion of untouchables into the mainstream, those who are not just Dalits or untouchables, but all those who are marginalized, the honesty and the probity that Gandhi advocated in public life, the rejection of material pursuits or the shunning of worldly pleasures. It is interesting that these values, these ideals of personal as well as public life that we associate with Gandhi are the same standards by which the nation, India as a nation, has come to be judged in world polity. And there are perhaps two reasons why, why Gandhi's philosophy or Gandhism is regarded as the gospel truth, not just in public life in India, but it also is responsible for India's reputation itself as a country, as a nation in the international arena, in global politics. And the first reason I believe is that Gandhian thought and Gandhian philosophy has been, India's most respected and most respected moral and intellectual export to the world. I mean, nothing surpasses this. And we are not even talking about a product. We are talking about Gandhian philosophy as a political philosophy, one that has, like I said, one that continues to have a profound influence on the very nature of international politics. So Gandhi continues to be an abiding influence in world politics, in the international arena, because and by reflection, it brings a lot of leverage, it brings a lot of significance and importance to India, because he and his philosophy are India's most respected moral and intellectual export to the world. And second, of course, Gandhi continues to, as I said, to inspire leaders and people in the world over, it was not Mark Zuckerberg, but Gandhi and Satyagraha and non-violence that inspired both the Wall Street movement as well as the Arab Occupy, the Wall Street Occupy uprising, as well as the Arab Revolution in recent times. I was going through, the homepage of the Gandhi Institute in Rochester, and I found that they're doing the Institute is doing some amazing work under the directorship of Keith Miller, particularly in the areas of nonviolent education, promoting nonviolent education, spreading awareness about environmental sustainability, also involving implementing a series of projects related to restorative social justice and racial justice. In fact, when you look at, my focus is more on the proliferation of Gandhi in popular culture. One of the, again, fascinating things about how Gandhi seeps through our memory as well as our imagination is that no political leader in India has perhaps more roads, streets, villages, bastis, or as we call bastis or slums, named after him than Gandhi. And ironically, most illegal human settlements also that have encroached on government land are named after Gandhi. So, and I don't, if you look at the slide on the bottom of the slide, ironically, again, Gandhi's face, it is Gandhi's face that has become the centerpiece of Indian currency notes since 1996. And that is very, it can't be, there can't be a more irony than this, that Gandhi, who shunned material pursuits and the accumulation of wealth, should be the face of the Indian revenue system as well as the market. But the point is that Gandhi is not only in India, Gandhi is not only a visible material reality, but also a mythical presence, and that is the focus of my talk. He's a mythical he's a mythical idea in the collective consciousness of the people as well as the nation's imagination. And so the myth of Gandhi has been produced, distributed, and consumed in various forms of popular culture. His life and his teachings have been the subject of innumerable films, musicals, theater, poetry, television serials, graphic novels, calendar art, posters, cartoons, and even jokes. Now these popular forms of culture have mythified Gandhi as the Mahatma, and as well as demonized him as a schemer. And this is the problem. This is the complex problem that we need to deliberate upon, that we need to think about, that when we associate Gandhi and his representation in popular arts or in popular culture. Because the fascinating thing about this cultural phenomena, that is the representation of Gandhi in various artistic forms, is that they seem to develop right from the beginning, right from Gandhi's own time. This cultural phenomena seems to develop along two diametrically opposite ways. In films, particularly in films and literature, these trend to be usually, the first trend is that, they are usually, a lot of films and a lot of novels tend to be uh, hagiographic in nature, that is, worshipping Gandhi, deifying him, and in the process removing the man Gandhi as far as possible from the Mahatma. These narratives place the father of the nation on a pedestal by their visual and oral tropes, their narrative symbols, and the meanings that they constitute. On the other hand, there are also films and literature that have shown Gandhi in a negative light, often highlighting his personal failings as a man or even his mistakes as a political leader. Friends, popular culture, both in India as well as in the West, therefore, has been a very long and debatable engagement with the tension and ambiguity of capturing the real Gandhi. And more often than not, these narratives in popular culture have failed to capture the real Gandhi, even if even if the word real Gandhi itself is a very complex and complicated word. So how is Gandhi popular in popular culture? What are the various forms? Well, think about typically for most Indians, like I remember that I first came to know of Gandhi or read about Gandhi, in school, for example, in the fifth or the sixth standard. And school textbooks and Amar Chitra Katha, for example, this very famous Anand Pai's series of comics based on both mythological characters as well as political leaders in India. So it was school textbooks and Amar Chitra Katha comics that taught me that Bapu, as he's fondly called by us, almost single-handedly united the whole of India to drive out the British using non-violent ways. Later on, as I grew up, and like most other Indians, you know, we came to know that, from left-leaning and right-wing intellectuals who accused Gandhi that Gandhi was a thoroughgoing racist and casteist, that he was an anti-feminist, and some even accuse him that he was responsible for the partition of India. Well, along the years, there have been a range of depictions of the Mahatma in popular culture, in popular discourse. Like I said, from an apostle of non-violence in period films and literature to even ultra-violent portrayals in comics, animated productions, and video games of today. So indeed, India's most well-known freedom fighter and political leader has had an incredibly contentious afterlife. Uh, the fact is that wherever Gandhi went, he generated stories, especially stories in the popular press. During the freedom movement itself, his arrival at a place was often preceded by stories, and invariably was followed after his departure by many more stories. So, in fact, there was a perpetual myth making and parody on him and his exploits in the popular press, that is the newspapers of the early 20th century, that is at the height of the freedom movement in India. Um, this is something that comes across the study by subaltern historians, and a very prominent member of this subaltern studies group is the Indian historian Shahid Amin. In a seminal essay, Gandhi as Mahatma, uh, points out the myth making that took place. He gives examples of the myth making, how Gandhi was transformed into a myth by popular press during the freedom movement. And he cites an incident about Gandhi's visit to Gorakhpur, a town in Uttar Pradesh, in 1921. And Shahid Amin quotes the editorial of the newspaper, the English newspaper then, Pioneer, which reports the buzz that Gandhi's impending visit had created among the villagers and the rumors that were passed off as facts in the local press, that is the vernacular press. And, and this is what the pioneer, Shahid Amin, quotes, what the pioneer writes about Gandhi's visit and its aftermath. And the pioneer says, Mr. Gandhi is beginning, I quote, Mr. Gandhi is beginning to reap the penalty. He's beginning to reap the penalty of having allowed himself to be unofficially canonized, as we should say in the West, by his adoring countrymen. We say reap the penalty because it is inconceivable, the pioneer continues to write, that it is inconceivable that a man such as Gandhi, of his transparent candor and scrupulous regard for truth, should hear with chagrin the myths which are being associated with him as a worker of miracles. And then the pioneer goes on to give 4 miracles. It cites 4 miracles, and I'm going to read out only 2 from that press report. So it says, 4 miracles were quoted last month by the vernacular newspapers in Abdi, Urdu, and Hindi as being popularly attributed to Mr. Gandhi. 2 of the miracles are recounted as follows. One miracle is that a man who refused to give alms to a sadhu, that is a saint, begging in Gandhi's name, had his 2 buffaloes destroyed by fire, and that the second rumor, and that a skeptical Brahmin who defied Mr. Gandhi's authority went mad and was only cured 3 days afterwards by the invocation of his saintly name. You know, it is such kind of myth making in the popular press that I believe is turned Gandhi into a miracle worker, particularly in the countryside during the freedom movement. We must remember that when in 1917 Gandhi first used satyagraha, and we know this is common knowledge, as when Gandhi used satyagraha as a political tool against the British for the first time in mobilizing the peasants, the farmers of Champaran village in Bihar, he was still an unknown entity as a political figure, as a political leader to the rural masses. Forget about the rural masses knowing him as a Mahatma. We remember that the period from 1915 to 1922, after he returned to India from South Africa in 1914, this period between 1915 and 1922, Gandhi traveled extensively, covering the length and breadth of the country. And so when people turning up in the remotest village where he visited in massive numbers to have his darshan, to have his audience, to look at him. So local leaders, party functionaries, and followers all contributed in the myth-making exercise, both by circulating previously created cache of fantastic, incredible stories about Gandhi, or inventing new ones along the way. So it's interesting that when you go back to these press reports, newspapers, both English as well as the vernacular press, and how they reported Gandhi's visits and Gandhi's travels, it's interesting that one can see that as Gandhi traveled, tales followed him. Tales about him traveled along his trail. So there is this very interesting work that has that over a period of in the last 4 or 5 decades that has been done by the subaltern historians in India, and some prominent names that include in this group are Ronaldjit Guho, Dipesh Chakraborty, Partha Chatterjee, Gyanendra Pandey, and of course Shahid Amin, whom I quoted. They all have recovered and compiled a number of stories about Gandhi that circulated in the press. And this archive, to go back and study this archive, is to discover how, mixing truth with fiction, facts with fantasy, in reports and stories, popularized Gandhi as a saint who could work miracles, as a religious preacher whose mere darshan could solve all practical problems, or even a god worthy of worship. So the mythical figure of Gandhi produced an enormous body of literature, including fiction. And if you go back to the literature of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, for example, I'll give you one example. Here is, you know, the Bengali novel. There's a Bengali novel written in 1941. It is titled Dhurai Chorit Manush. The writer, this novel was written by the writer Shotinath Bhaduri, and in this novel, Bhaduri creates the main character in his story is a peasant in rural Bihar, and who when he comes to know about Gandhi, when he sees Gandhi and falls at his feet, after Gandhi leaves, he kind of conflates Gandhi with Lord Rama and begins to call him as Purushottam Bapu. Purushottam Bapu. Now, the word Purushottam, that is the best among men, is sacrosanct, is particularly sacred in Hindu mythology because it is used as an appellation for Lord Rama. So by using this epithet for Gandhi, Dhurai, the main character in Shotinath Bhaduri's novel, in a sense expressed the common perception of the Mahatma in the mind of India's rural folk. And so one may conclude that, regional stories, vernacular stories that were written and that were circulated throughout the countryside played a very prominent role in the myth making of Gandhi, in making not only Gandhi known what he was and how and what he was doing for the country, but also in turning him into almost giving him a divine and exalted status. So much so that one may conclude, and if you look at the quote at the bottom of this slide, it is Shahid Amin again from his essay on Gandhi, who says that you cannot write about Gandhi without writing about the Mahatma. And so what he means is that when someone writes about Gandhi, you have to write about how people regarded him. And often people not only regarded him, but they venerated him, they worshipped him, and they deified him. And that is the myth of Gandhi that started out at the turn of the century and continues to take place even in today's time. So literature is replete, whether it is vernacular literature, that is in the Bhasha literature, or whether it is English literature. All of them have tried to capture Gandhi and his philosophy in many different ways. I mean, from Mulk Raj Anand to Sarojini Naidu, to Dominic Lapierre, to George Orwell and Khushwant Singh, to V.S. Naipaul, all have referred to the life of Bapu in their writings, in their works, and in doing so, they have brought different interpretations to his sayings. They have sketched fictional characters based on his principles, and they've even composed verses on him. So, but not all of them. The fascinating thing about tracing how Gandhi is mythified in literature is that not everybody has mythified him, has represented him in positive terms. For example, I mean, George Orwell, put Gandhi on trial in his writings, and Orwell referred to Gandhi as the shrewd person beneath the saint, and asserted that his ideals of spirituality, his spinning wheel, and even the practice of vegetarianism were all self-serving tools to create an image of himself. However, despite this negative picture of Gandhi, even Orwell was forced to add an aura to Gandhi by describing him as a humble, naked old saint, and I quote, sitting on a prayer mat, attempting to shake the British Empire by utter spiritual power. So, veritably, every minute of Gandhi's life has found a place in fictional writings. But as we know, when stories reach people, they mutate into something even more magical. And these mutations, I feel, haven't stopped even in the 150th year of Gandhi's anniversary celebrations. And it makes us draw the conclusion that there's a curious fact that India as a nation has been continuously reproducing and recreating the father of the nation in various garbs, in various avatars, mixing history with mythology as well as with fiction and literature. Friends, the same cultural phenomena of the mythification of Gandhi is more prominently seen in Gandhi in films, for example. The Mahatma in movies. And this is the second strand of my narrative, from Gandhism to Gandhigiri. Gandhi may not have never thought of much of cinema, but cinema has always been interested in Gandhi. And the first fictional portrayal of Gandhi appears to have been in the 1963 film 9 Hours to Rama. Now, this film was based on a novel by Stanley Walpert, the American historian and writer, and it imagines Gandhi's killer. The focus of the film, or the main character of the film, is not Gandhi, but Gandhi's assassin, Nathuram Godse, in the hours leading up to the assassination. This is one of the first films on Gandhi shot in CinemaScope, and it is extremely riveting, but at the same time unintentionally funny, because many of the Indian characters played by Hollywood actors, speak English in a variety of foreign accents, and including the actor who played Godse, who's a man whom we remember from the Magnificent Seven, from the film Magnificent Seven. The actor who plays Godse speaks English in a very pronounced Germanic English accent. But an interesting sidelight to the movie and the book 9 Hours to Rama is that it was never released in India, neither the book nor the film. Because Nehru banned both the book and the film in 1962 on the charge that they showed Gandhi in a very poor light. So, while Gandhi's life and work have fascinated filmmakers around the world, he himself had a very low opinion of cinema, and on one occasion he even described cinema as an evil. In his entire life, we come to know that Gandhi saw only one film, and that was Vijay Bhatt's Ram Rajya, a mythological film that was made in 1943. And even when India's groundbreaking first feature film, Dadasaheb Phalke's Raja Harishchandra, was released, Gandhi turned down an invitation to view the film. What is intriguing is that Gandhi never thought of using cinema, one of the most popular one of the most prominent mediums of popular culture, to spread his message. In fact, Gandhi openly, as I said, expressed his contempt for cinema, telling the Indian Cinematograph Committee, before the Film Division Society came into place, that, and I quote, he said, "I've never been to a cinema, but even to an outsider, the evil that it has done and is doing is patent. The good, if it has done any at all, remains to be proved." So it's, I find it rather difficult to believe that a man who created symbols out of everyday objects and, made them into powerful totems of political revolution and social change, like, for example, the charkha, the spinning wheel, or khadi, that is cotton, never thought of using cinema as an effective medium of spreading his message. Not even for political purposes. And in this context, we remember. I remember how, for example, we know Leni Riefenstahl, for example, the woman filmmaker and documentary producer, and her documentary, what her documentaries did for Hitler and his war propaganda. So maybe one can only perhaps guess that. It was probably because Gandhi's dislike of the medium stemmed from his basic opposition to technology. But there again, there's a caveat, and because we cannot be sure of drawing such conclusions, because Gandhi did use the news media to popularize his campaign. And how, for example, at a point in time, Gandhi was himself bringing out 3 newspapers: Young India, Harijan, and Navjeevan. Young India in English and the 2 in Gujarati. Attenborough's Gandhi, again, it strikes me, as one of the most astonishing facts that there has been no full-length made in India biopic on Gandhi. One that captures a Hindi film or any regional film that captures the man and his role in the historical struggle for independence. And so for many Indians, even, Richard Attenborough's brilliant but often factually flawed, historically flawed Gandhi still remains the only cinematic introduction to Gandhi as the father of the nation. How the film got made is a story by itself. And this probably, I'd like to share this with you. It was in 1962. The film was made in 1982, but it was in 1962 that Attenborough got a call from a British Indian and a Gandhian by heart, Motilal Kothari, who invited him to discuss the idea for making a film on Gandhi. Motilal, in fact, sent Attenborough what is still considered to be one of the greatest, one of the most, one of the most authentic biographies on Gandhi, Louis Fisher's, I'm referring to Louis Fisher's book, The Life of Mahatma Gandhi, to read. So a year later, that is in 1963, Attenborough met Nehru in Delhi to seek the approval for his project. And this is interesting, that what was Nehru's advice to Attenborough? So Nehru told Attenborough, and the quote is on the slide, that whatever you do, do not deify him. That is, and the full quote is, that is what we have done in India. This is Nehru saying to Attenborough about Gandhi, that whatever you do, do not deify him. That is what we have done in India, and he was, and please pay attention, and he was too great a man to be deified. Interesting. So, and he also quipped that the idea of being portrayed by an Englishman as Gandhi would have made Bapu laugh a great deal. So, of course, I mean, for various reasons, it took nearly another 20 years for Attenborough to finally complete the biopic on Gandhi. Curiously enough, the title role went Ben Kingsley, as we know, a son of a British doctor of Gujarati origin, and it turned out to be one of the most inspiring bits of casting in film history, because Ben Kingsley, his wonderful impersonation of Gandhi won him an Oscar. But when the film came out, it got mixed reviews, and one in a very prominent one of the Indian reviewers, one of the Indian film critics, Khalid Muhammad, he said that Kingsley emerges from the film more Gandhi than Gandhi. He said Kingsley emerges from the film more Gandhi than Gandhi. In other words, according to him, Kingsley's performance as Gandhi further amplified the already mythic stature of Gandhi that was in people's imagination. Now, on a lighter side, there is a story that when the statue of Gandhi was unveiled in London in 2015, nearly 3 decades after after Attenborough's Gandhi, Tushar Gandhi, the great grandson of the Mahatma, posted on Facebook that a comment that it resembled, that the statue of Gandhi unveiled in London resembled Kingsley more than more than his own great grandfather. Uh, so in the process of mythifying Gandhi, what critics like Kingsley and Tushar Gandhi were trying to draw our attention to, that a lot of difference, a lot of distance takes place between Gandhi the man and Gandhi in films, for instance. Not surprisingly, even Salman Rushdie, in a very popular essay that we have read, called Attenborough's Gandhi, he titles the essay, Salman Rushdie titles this essay as Attenborough's Gandhi, not India's Gandhi, Attenborough's Gandhi. And he says that the film is inadequate as biography and appalling as history, that it's a perversion of history, that Attenborough didn't do enough research, and that Kingsley, in his own portrayal, even though it was a brilliant portrayal, missed out on who the real Gandhi was, the essence of Gandhi. And so, like I said, there were a lot of criticism. The film, of course, had a worldwide release. Just, think about this. Gandhi, the film earned Attenborough $25 million just in terms of DVD rights sold in the US. DVD rights, we are talking of 80s and 90s, right? And so one of the allegations, however, and which I think is a fair allegation, was that the film Gandhi showed Gandhi as a saint who vanquished the British Empire, while underplaying the role of other freedom fighters like Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And that, Attenborough, in an interview did admit to having deliberately omitted certain parts of Gandhi's life, because he felt showing those aspects of Gandhi on the screen would be unpalatable particularly to Indian audiences. For example, Gandhi's pretty disturbed relationship with his children, especially his eldest son Harilal, or his problems with his own wife Kasturba, or Ba as we know, or his experiments with diet, sexuality, and celibacy. So all of these things were elided in the film. And so despite the honest intentions behind Attenborough's Gandhi, it remains an incontestable fact that Gandhi is nothing more. The film Gandhi is nothing more than a hagiographic film. It is an historical myth-making film. So where is Gandhi in popular cinema? I mean, that is the question that a very prominent research scholar, Rachel Dyer, who is a professor of Indian culture and cinema at the School of Oriental and African Studies, in an essay titled "The Case of the Missing Mahatma." She says, where is Gandhi in India today? Is he forgotten and irrelevant to the new India? And what does it say about Indian popular cinema and its depiction of Gandhi and of history on film? Well, yes, if one examines this phenomenon, this missing case of Gandhi, one might suggest that by the end of the 20th century, India had already changed, and film-going audiences in India also had changed. By the 1990s, for example, we know that the forces of economic liberalization and market capitalism had not only brought changes to the economy, but also changed the cinematic preferences of the masses. And so the Mahatma's ideal of simple living and high thinking was no longer an inspiration for the cinema-going public as it had once been. So this declining interest in Gandhi and a certain disenchantment with Gandhism, the philosophy of Gandhi, was increasingly evident in the low viewership for films on Gandhi that were made post-1990s, like The Making of the Mahatma by Shyam Benegal, which was a commercial failure. Kamal Hassan's Hey Ram also proved to be a flop. The point that I'm making is that that the popularity of Gandhi in Indian cinema throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s hit an all-time low. But then came Rajkumar Hirani's Lage Raho Munna Bhai, or that is, maybe Carry On Munna Bhai in 2006, and it created history. It brought Gandhi back into the popular imagination of Indians with a bang. And the film Lage Raho Munna Bhai is actually is not a film on Gandhi. Because it's a fairy tale. It's a sort of a fairy tale of a lovable gangster, a local dada, as we call, who, in order to win the girl whom he loves, a radio jockey, pretends to be a professor of history and a Gandhian scholar, no less. In fact, he gets to be on the radio jockey's show by successfully by succeeding in answering most of were prompted by others on a quiz on Gandhi. So the film actually is a comedy. It's not a historical film. It is a comedy. It is a fairy tale romance. And it is, and Gandhi's in the film is more, Hirani's Gandhi is more about a benign myth of Gandhi again, rather than Gandhi as a historical figure. But this Gandhi reinvented in 2006 by Hirani is not, as I said, the nationalist figure, a Gandhi who urged us to boycott foreign goods and abandon consumerism, but rather a pragmatic Gandhi, whom Hirani, and this is interesting, whom Hirani, the film director, tailor-made and altered to please the aspirations of India's new middle classes, so that they could taste the success of shining India. So the Gandhi of Lage Raho Munna Bhai is not a political or historical Gandhi, but a Gandhi who is the symbolic figure of inner conscience and moral guide. And Hirani morphs Gandhi into a fairy godmother, one who helps Munna to help people and become a hero. So what I find unique about Lage Raho Munna Bhai is that Munna, the central character in the film, adopts Gandhism and turns it into Gandhigiri. And this is important. This reinventing of Gandhism and transforming it into Gandhigiri is the one that recaptured Gandhi in the popular imagination. So even though, so much so that after the release of the film, Gandhigiri became so popular, it became not only the film's mantra and the film's USP, but after its release, people started using Gandhigiri, that is the use of non-violence, to protest and bring change by sending flowers to corrupt politicians in protest, or to get civic authorities, the municipal authorities, to repair roads, drains, and getting other things done. So it isn't an exaggeration to say that Lage Raho Munna Bhai helped the nation to reinvent and reconnect Gandhi. And this is a tribute to Hirani's directorial skills, for he succeeds, it is my opinion, for he succeeds in doing where most filmmakers, including Attenborough, failed. And that is navigate. Hirani was successful in navigating the middle path between unqualified admiration and unrestrained criticism of Gandhi. So, I believe that Lage Raho Munna Bhai was a landmark film in the history of Indian popular cinema. No surprise that the film won 4 national awards, including the Best Supporting Actor for Dilip Prabhavkar, who played the role of Gandhi in the film. Friends, the examples that I've given, especially from Gandhi's, the representation of Gandhi in films, it is interesting that we can draw a parallel between the historiography of Hindi cinema and the mythology of Gandhi, because it seems to me that they overlap each other in very unusual and interesting ways. So the cinematic image of Gandhi has had what I call an indexical correspondence with the political and social life of the nation itself. And herein, as I wrap up my talk, I trace the trajectory of the mythifying of Gandhi with the cinematic representation of India as a nation itself. And I broadly put it in 3 stages. for example, the films of the 50s and the 60s, whether you're talking about Shantaram's films or Raj Kapoor's films, focused on Gandhi's, for example, Ram Rajya, his rural utopia that he envisioned, or the founding, the most cherished ideals and values that we associate with Gandhism. Then came the second stage, or the second wave, and films of the 1970s where the arrival of the angry young man heralded a new kind of cinema. And generally, it was a rejection of Gandhism. So the films of the 70s was ridding Gandhi, ridding the nation in its cinematic imagination of Gandhi. And finally, Gandhi being rediscovered or reinvented with Rajkumar Hirani's Lage Rao Munna Bhai in 2006. As I come to the close of my talk, just a couple of final words, final comments that I leave you with. What I've tried to cover in my talk is to give you a few examples from popular culture to demonstrate their crucial role, the role that they played in constructing a mythology of Gandhi. A myth, friends, is neither a lie nor a confession. It is an inflection, said Roland Barthes, a cultural theorist and mythologist, in his book called Mythologies. And so the narratives about Gandhi, in my opinion, the narratives of Gandhi in popular culture are not only inflected by myth-making about the Mahatma, but also inflected in the imaginary construction of India as a nation. So the figure of Bapu in popular culture leads me to conclude that the figure of Bapu in popular culture is both a myth and a metaphor of India itself. And I leave you with this quote, which kind of points out the balance between criticism and admiration that is often used in diametrically extreme ways in the portrayal of Gandhi in popular culture. And the quote is from Gandhi himself, who says that no man's life can be encompassed in one telling. There is no way to give each year its allotted weight, to include each event, each person who helped to shape a lifetime. What can be done is to be faithful in spirit to the record and try to find one's way to the heart of the man. Friends, Gandhi will continue to be worshipped as the father of the nation. And popular culture will continue to engage with the Mahatma, sometimes contesting, sometimes praising, sometimes eulogizing, sometimes appropriating him, sometimes perverting and suppressing him. But all of these narratives will add to the myth of Gandhi in the national discourse. Besides Gandhi being a saint, or rather the popular images of Gandhi being a saint, a martyr, or even a punching bag, Gandhi seems to me has become, or we have made Gandhi a kind of a post-modern, post-national, free-floating signifier. By that I mean that it seems to me that Gandhi as a signifier, as a symbol, it's like anyone can put him to any use from anywhere in any time. And so, somewhere between the popular myth of the Mahatma and the historical figure of Gandhi, Bapu will always remain alive in our hearts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. Can I see you?
Hello? Yes, Yogesh.
Thank you, Prantik, for this holistic and very interesting module where you did make things very easy. My only one question is, like in 20... Hello?
You're not audible.
Yeah. My only question is, Dr. Banerjee, that in 2020, when the things are changing so fast, how the popular culture will again adopt Gandhi in new version? Can you just tell me, or can you just project, like what will be the new avenues or the areas where he might dissipate as far as his own pop culture is concerned?
Well, my answer, like your question, is going to be very speculative. Like I said,
Okay.
perhaps in no other time in history is Gandhi perhaps more relevant than to the pandemic, to the ongoing pandemic crisis that we are facing. And great crisis always brings out not only great literature, but it also makes us go back to to people whom we revere, people from whom we seek guidance and direction. And therefore, how Gandhi will continue to be represented in popular culture post COVID-19. I put that I reframe your question in a post 19 time, is rather difficult for me to say, but there will be, as I said, forget post COVID 19, perhaps the relevance of Gandhi. I started my talk by saying that perhaps Gandhi's significance and relevance, the way in which we associate Gandhi with common compassion and humanity, is something that we need to instill and need to follow, even as we are coping with our pandemic crisis, being more charitable, being more generous, and being more appreciative of ordinary people doing ordinary things in ordinary people doing extraordinary things in extraordinary times.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee, for this beautiful and very edutaining lecture. Thank you very much. Professor
Thanks.
Sinha,
Thanks, Doctor.
Yeah, yes, sir.
can we start the third module? Brajesh Singh, he has joined.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we are going to start the third module. So,
Yeah.
yes. So,